You think going no contact shields you from a narcissist? It really doesn't. Because even after you cut them off, block them, erase the chats, and erase their digital footprints, they still linger in your mind, quietly reshaping your thoughts from the shadows. But here's the truth most people never mention. You can completely shatter a narcissist's ego without lifting a hand, speaking a single sentence, or seeking revenge of any kind. There is one internal shift, one psychological turning point that impacts them far more deeply than anything you could ever express. And I'm going to reveal exactly what that shift is and how to achieve it. Before I walk you through how to reach that level of mental distancing, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who desperately needs to break free, not only physically, but mentally. Because what you're about to hear is the part that finally places you back in control of your own mind and emotions. When people talk about no contact, they usually imagine it as simply cutting communication, blocking their number, deleting messages, removing photos, and getting rid of their social media presence. And yes, that's important. But that isn't the real battlefield. The true battle takes place inside your mind because the narcissist's greatest weapon was never their physical presence. It was the mental hooks they embedded in you long before you ever went no contact. These hooks are the doubts they planted in your mind, the guilt they conditioned into you, the belief that somehow you owed them explanations, validation, apologies, or emotional effort. Even after you cut them off, these hooks keep tugging from the inside. You find yourself replaying old conversations, imagining what you should have said, wondering whether you were unfair, too cold, too emotional, or too distant. You may feel compelled to prove you weren't the one at fault. You may still crave closure, recognition, honesty, or some acknowledgement of the pain they put you through. All of this keeps them alive psychologically inside you. A narcissist functions like hidden malware. Even after you delete the program, fragments remain running in the background unless you intentionally clear them out. No contact stops the external chaos, but the internal damage continues if you're still running their emotional code. They trained you to question yourself, to put their reactions above your own needs, to protect their ego, to adjust your behavior to soothe their insecurity, and to anticipate their mood swings. Those patterns don't vanish just because you block them. They remain as automatic habits, over-explaining, apologizing too quickly, fearing rejection, shrinking yourself to avoid conflict, or believing you must earn love through effort or sacrifice. When those habits continue, the narcissist still has a level of control. Their ego doesn't need physical access to survive. It only needs you to continue emotionally revolving around them. That's why no contact by itself is not enough. Without mental detachment, you're still responding internally to a person who isn't even present, which means they continue occupying the most valuable space you possess, your attention. For a narcissist, attention is their oxygen. And the moment you stop feeding it, even privately inside your mind, their psychological grip begins to dissolve. You start reclaiming your power the moment you recognize that the version of yourself they convinced you to believe in was never real, and you stop giving their voice power over your worth. This is where their ego actually feels the impact, when you no longer think in relation to them at all. People often assume the only way to wound a narcissist is to confront them, call them out, expose their behavior, or tell them everything they put you through. But none of that truly crushes their ego, because confrontation still gives them something they crave: your emotional energy, your intensity, anger, sadness, frustration, heartbreak, even your desire for closure. All of it signals that they still influence your inner world. A narcissist interprets this as proof of their significance. That's why yelling at them, blocking them dramatically, or sending long emotional messages never lands the way you expect. It doesn't destabilize them. It feeds them. It reassures them that they still matter in your emotional universe. What a narcissist cannot tolerate is emotional indifference, not silence filled with pain, not silence that secretly hopes they notice, but silence rooted in true detachment. When you stop explaining yourself, stop defending your choices, stop trying to win, fix, or justify anything, you cut off the emotional supply that fuels their inflated sense of superiority. They thrive on your reactions because your reaction equals relevance. The moment your reactions disappear, they experience a kind of ego starvation. They don't know how to handle a version of you that neither moves toward them nor away from them, doesn't resist or cling, doesn't blame or beg. Indifference removes their power because their entire identity depends on being able to provoke emotional disruptions in others. This is why trying to win emotionally never works. The moment you're trying, you're already trapped in their system. The only force that truly shakes their ego is showing them, through your lack of internal response, that they no longer have access to your inner world. Indifference communicates one message clearly: they no longer have importance, and irrelevance is the deepest wound for someone whose entire sense of self depends on external admiration. When your emotional landscape becomes neutral where they are concerned, they encounter something rarely felt: insignificance. They may lash out, attempt to hoover, provoke you, test you, or pretend you never mattered. All of these behaviors are attempts to restore the emotional fuel you quietly withdrew. Indifference is not pretending you're fine. It's genuinely no longer needing their understanding, apology, validation, or acknowledgement. This is the moment their ego starts collapsing internally, because for the first time in your entire connection, they are not being fed by the emotional reaction they relied on to feel powerful. Shifting your internal narrative is essential because narcissists don't just manipulate your behavior while you're with them. They manipulate the story you tell yourself long after they're gone. Throughout the relationship, they slowly condition you to distrust your own perceptions and replace them with their version of events. They make you question your memory, your judgment, your motives, your value, and even your emotional reactions. Over time, their interpretation of reality becomes more important to you than your own. This is why, even after separation, you may still hear their voice in your head criticizing you, undermining you, or minimizing what they did. That internalized voice keeps you psychologically tied to them even when you're physically free. The shift happens when you stop letting their narrative shape your reality. Instead of repeating the same harmful script, you're too sensitive, you're overreacting. It wasn't that serious. You're the issue. You begin replacing it with your own truth, your version of events, your understanding, your emotional experience. Because a narcissist's ego thrives when they can rewrite your perception. The moment you reclaim your perspective, their influence starts breaking apart. This isn't about fake positivity or forced confidence. It's about unraveling years of mental conditioning that trained you to take responsibility for their behavior. It's realizing that their manipulation was intentional, strategic, and predictable, not caused by anything you did wrong. When you shift your narrative from self-blame to self-awareness, you release the guilt and confusion that kept you attached emotionally. You stop protecting them inside your mind. You stop excusing their actions. You stop rewriting the past to make them look better. And the most powerful shift of all, you stop believing that their lack of empathy reflects your worth. Their cruelty becomes a reflection of their limitations, not your inadequacy. This internal shift is more powerful than any external boundary because once the story inside you changes, their psychological control dissolves. You finally see the relationship for what it truly was instead of what they manipulated you into believing. And when that clarity becomes solid, their ego loses the invisible grip it once had over your mind. A narcissist's ego doesn't crumble when you confront them, expose them, or even walk away. Those actions barely unsettle them because they can always twist the narrative to keep themselves centered. What truly breaks a narcissist internally is emotional detachment, not silence rooted in fear or pain, not silence waiting for them to react, but silence that communicates you feel nothing toward them anymore. They need emotional reactions the way fire needs oxygen. Your pain, your anger, your confusion, your attempts to understand or fix things, all of that fuels their sense of importance. As long as you're emotionally tied, they feel powerful. Detachment is not disappearing physically, it's the absence of internal movement. Their message doesn't make your heart race. Their name doesn't create tension. Their behavior no longer sends you into overthinking mode. When you stop reacting inside yourself, you starve the ego that once fed on your vulnerability. Narcissists crave emotional chaos because it gives them access to you. When that chaos dies, so does their influence. They can't drag you into arguments, guilt trips, or nostalgic memories. They can't bait you into explaining your intent or defending your character. You stop dancing to their emotional rhythm, and that stillness is what destabilizes them. What makes emotional starvation so threatening to them is that it forces them to confront the truth they spend their entire lives avoiding. Without someone to feed on, their sense of self collapses. They cannot create self-worth internally. They extract it through others. When you detach, they feel the void immediately. They may rage, hoover, smear, or act indifferent, but all of it is evidence of the injury. Detachment forces them to face their own emptiness, something they avoid at all costs. Emotional starvation isn't about punishing them. It's about reclaiming your peace so fully that they no longer exist as a psychological presence. That absence is the blow their ego cannot recover from. Physical silence is simple. You can block, delete, unfollow. But emotional silence is where the actual transformation happens. Because emotional silence isn't about what you do, it's about what you no longer feel compelled to do. Narcissists don't panic when you stop communicating. They panic when you stop responding internally. They sense the difference. If your silence is filled with pain, longing, confusion, or hope that they'll notice, they feel safe. They know you're still theirs emotionally. And that emotional tie is the leash they always pulled. Emotional silence is something completely different. It means you no longer analyze their reactions. You no longer replay their words in your mind. You no longer adjust who you are to avoid upsetting them. It means their emotional weather no longer controls your inner state. Narcissists survive on emotional energy, not just outward expressions, but the emotions you generate internally. If you're still anxious about their opinion of you, still trying to understand their behavior, still hoping they'll one day acknowledge what they did, then you're not truly silent. You're still feeding them emotionally. Emotional silence is when they no longer occupy your mental space. You stop rehearsing imaginary conversations. You stop anticipating future interactions. You stop carving out mental room for someone who never offered the same. This type of silence breaks the psychological cycle that kept them elevated in your mind. It dismantles the emotional loop they rely on to feel significant when they can no longer provoke a reaction, not through guilt, manipulation, nostalgia, or even absence. They lose the emotional leverage that once made them feel powerful. They no longer feed on your confusion or desire for closure. Emotional silence shows them you've reached a place they can't enter. It's the point where your healing becomes louder than their chaos. And nothing wounds a narcissist more than realizing their name, presence, and memory no longer disturb your peace. When you stop performing for them, stop defending yourself, stop offering explanations, you shut down the mechanism they rely on to maintain control. They train you to believe you owe them emotional effort. The constant explaining, defending, proving, and smoothing things over that keep you tied to their distorted reality. Every time you explain your intentions or defend your character, you reinforce their control. You're essentially saying, your interpretation of me matters more than my own. And that's exactly what they want. They want to be the narrator of your life, the judge, the authority. The moment you no longer need them to understand you, the dynamic shifts. You start operating from a place they can't reach because they no longer have the ability to manipulate your self-perception. Narcissists manipulate through confusion, twisting your words, dismissing your feelings, pulling you into endless cycles of explanations that never lead anywhere. They don't listen to understand. They listen to regain control. They want you drained, unbalanced, and emotionally dependent on their approval. When you stop explaining, you break the validation loop they rely on. Justifying yourself is another form of emotional surrender. It means you're still hoping they'll see your perspective or treat you fairly if you explain well enough. But narcissists don't reward clarity. They punish it. The more direct you are, the more they distort. The more you defend yourself, the more they attack. The more you try to reason, the more unreasonable they become. They don't want truth or resolution. They want dominance. Removing the impulse to justify anything starves their ego. You stop reacting on their emotional schedule. You stop giving them reassurance that they still matter. Your calm, your silence, your refusal to argue, these are not signs of weakness. They signal that you are no longer willing to participate in a game designed to exhaust you. And nothing destabilizes a narcissist more than realizing they can no longer push you into defending your worth. Rebuilding your identity after a narcissist isn't just healing, it's liberation. Narcissists don't simply lower your confidence, they mold you into a version of yourself that benefits them. They assign you a role: the fixer, the pleaser, the apologizer, the stabilizer, the one who absorbs chaos so they don't have to face their own. By the time the relationship ends, you've been living as an edited version of yourself, shrunken, censored, reshaped to avoid triggering their rage, insecurity, or punishments. When you break away, you don't just lose them. You lose the self you were forced to become. Rebuilding your identity means stepping out of the mold they constructed. They thrive on the version of you that needs their approval, chases their validation, fears their withdrawal, and tries to earn love through sacrifice. When you begin rebuilding, you become unrecognizable to them, not because you're turning into someone new, but because you're returning to who you always were. You start making decisions based on your values instead of their reactions. You stop apologizing for existing. You stop minimizing your strengths so they can feel large. You rediscover dreams, passions, and traits they once mocked or dismissed. Slowly, the version of you they crafted becomes irrelevant. This change wounds them because narcissists need you frozen in the identity they assigned. They need you predictable, manageable, and emotionally dependent. When you grow beyond that, their ego feels threatened. They lose the blueprint that once allowed them to manipulate you effortlessly. Your confidence becomes a wall. Your clarity becomes armor. Your self-trust becomes something they can't penetrate. They cannot control someone who knows who they are. Rebuilding your identity is not about revenge. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself that were silenced for their benefit. And the truth is this: nothing injures a narcissist more than realizing the pain they use to weaken you is the same pain you use to strengthen yourself. When you rebuild, you break the cycle. When you rediscover who you are, they lose the version of you they depended on, and that loss cuts deeper than anything you could ever say. The deepest wound to a narcissist's ego is not your anger, not your tears, not even your absence. It's the moment you no longer feel anything connected to them. They can survive being hated. They can survive being confronted. They can survive you leaving. What they cannot survive is becoming emotionally irrelevant. Their entire sense of power depends on your reactions, your confusion, your desire to understand them, and the emotional turbulence they create inside you. As long as you feel anything intense, love, pain, guilt, fear, longing, they feel significant. When you reach the place where their name doesn't trigger memories, their behavior doesn't demand analysis, and their absence doesn't create longing, that is when their ego cracks. Narcissists rely on emotional resonance. They need to know they still influence your internal world, even if they're no longer present. When that resonance disappears, they lose what they believe proves their superiority. They don't view emotions the same way normal people do. To them, your emotional response is a scoreboard. No reaction means they're losing. Feeling nothing doesn't mean you're cold. It means you finally place them in the correct emotional category, irrelevant. They are no longer the person you need answers from, apologies from, or clarity from. The emotional loop closes not because they resolved anything, but because you outgrew the need. They can't reach that level of emotional elevation. They can only impact people who still care, even if the care shows up as anger or hurt. When you become emotionally neutral, you stop being a source of supply. They can't guilt, gaslight, hoover, or confuse you back into giving them validation. That disconnection forces them to feel the emptiness they've been running from, the emptiness they masked using your emotional energy. And even though you're not doing it to hurt them, it hurts them anyway, because their ego depends on believing they are unforgettable. Your emotional freedom is the one outcome they never anticipated.